20 Golden Age stars who dabbled in dark magic and occult rituals. Their talent wasn't natural. These stars were raised from birth by satanic cults that trained them to infiltrate Hollywood and corrupt American values. And their performances were actually elaborate rituals designed to cast spells on audiences. And while some of these allegations were merely dark whispers, others were terrifyingly real. We have verified records of stars who performed intimate magic in the Mojave Desert, leading men who worshipped Baphomet in the Hollywood Hills, and children raised in systems of control so absolute, they make modern cults look like summer camps. But to understand the true darkness, we have to start with the lie that started it all. While the modern era is filled with conspiracy theories about the entertainment industry, the origins of this dark fascination trace back to the very dawn of cinema, beginning with a woman whose entire existence was manufactured to embody the occult. Long before the term goth existed, there was Theda Bara, the first star to be aggressively marketed not just as an actress, but as a supernatural entity. Born Theodosia Goodman, a shy Jewish girl from Cincinnati, Ohio, the Fox studio publicity machine erased her human background completely. In 1915, studio executives concocted a bizarre and terrifying biography for her, claiming she was born in the shadow of the Sphinx in Egypt, the daughter of a French artist and an Arabian mistress, and that her name was an anagram for Arab demise. The public was told that she possessed ancient, arcane powers, and that she was a vampire, a term that was shortened to vamp, and entered the lexicon to describe a predatory woman who used mystical allure to destroy men. The studio's commitment to this dark narrative was total, and the details they fabricated were ludicrously specific to ensure the illusion was impenetrable. They released press releases claiming that Theda Bara had a diet consisting of raw beef and blood, and that she could predict the future by reading the patterns of incense smoke. Bara was forbidden from appearing in public without a veil, and interviews were conducted in darkened rooms filled with incense and skulls. She was photographed with skeletons and snakes, imagery that was shocking for the 19-teens. This was Hollywood's first experiment in creating a cult of personality rooted in fear and mysticism. Audiences believed the hype, sending her letters begging her not to cast spells on their husbands or accusing her of bringing bad harvests. When she starred in Cleopatra in 1917, the studio marketed it not as a historical drama, but as a documentary of her past life, insinuating she was the reincarnation of the Egyptian queen herself. The film was a sensation, sparking protests from religious groups who believed Bara was a literal agent of the devil sent to corrupt the youth. However, the tragedy of Theda Bara was that the woman behind the veil was gentle, intellectual, and desperate to play wholesome roles. She famously said, "I have the face of a vampire, but the heart of a feminist." She was trapped in a prison of dark glamour, forced to embody a soulless creature while her true self withered in obscurity. The studio had essentially initiated her into a cult of their own making, demanding she sacrifice her identity on the altar of their prophets. Tragically, most of her films were lost in a 1937 vault fire at Fox, meaning the spells she cast on celluloid have largely vanished from history, leaving only the still images of her fabricated persona. When she finally tried to break free and play a normal woman, the public rejected her. The spell had been too effective. She passed away of stomach cancer in 1955, largely forgotten, her legacy reduced to a caricature of the darkness the studio had forced her to inhabit. Decades later, another blonde icon would dance even closer to the flames of the occult. But unlike Bara, her involvement was not merely a publicity stunt. Jane Mansfield, often dismissed as a Marilyn Monroe imitator, possessed a high IQ and a fascination with the macabre that led her directly to the doorstep of Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan. In the 1960s, as Mansfield's career began to wane, and her personal life descended into chaos, she found a strange comfort in LaVey's philosophy of self-empowerment and ritual. She became a high-profile presence at the Black House in San Francisco, and LaVey even named her a high priestess of the church. Photos from this era show the platinum star kneeling before satanic altars, drinking from chalices, and engaging in rituals that the press devoured with a mixture of horror and fascination. The dichotomy of her life was startling and disorienting for her fans. By day, she lived in her pink palace on Sunset Boulevard, a bubblegum-colored mansion with a heart-shaped pool and fountains that spouted pink champagne, projecting the image of a brainless bombshell. But by night, she was exploring the darkest corridors of the counterculture, seeking a spiritual dominance she couldn't find in Hollywood. She would reportedly bring LaVey to her pink mansion, where the dark rituals would clash, bizarrely, with the hyper-feminine decor of shag carpets and cupids. She even posed for a series of promotional photos titled The Devil's Dictionary, where she playfully interacted with satanic imagery, blurring the lines between irony and genuine belief. The narrative took a chilling turn, involving her attorney and boyfriend, Sam Brody. LaVey reportedly despised Brody and, in a moment of theatrical rage, placed a curse on him, warning Mansfield to stay away from the man or risk being caught in the crossfire of his doom. Mansfield, terrified but trapped in a volatile relationship, could not sever the tie. In the year following the curse, the couple survived no fewer than 7 car accidents, a statistical anomaly that fueled whispers of supernatural intervention. The final accident, on June 29, 1967, remains one of Hollywood's most gruesome tragedies. Mansfield, Brody, and their driver were instantly deprived of life when their car slammed under a tractor trailer on a foggy Louisiana highway. The bizarre nature of the accident, rumors persisted for years that she had been decapitated, though this was technically a wig flying off, and the prior warnings from LaVey cemented Mansfield's legend not just as a tragic bombshell, but as a caution against inviting dark forces into one's life. She sought control in a chaotic world through the occult, only to find that chaos is rarely something that can be tamed. While Mansfield sought power, the greatest lover of the silent screen, Rudolph Valentino, sought guidance from beyond the grave. The Latin lover, who made women swoon in the chic, was privately a man riddled with anxiety and insecurity, dependent on spirit guides to make his career decisions. Valentino's involvement with the occult was steered by his second wife, Natasha Rambova, a costume designer deeply immersed in theosophy and spiritualism. Rambova was a controlling figure who despised the commercialism of Hollywood, and she used their spiritual practice to isolate Valentino from his friends and advisors. Together, they participated in automatic writing sessions, where they believed they were communicating with a spirit entity named Black Feather, a Native American guide who dictated Valentino's professional choices. This reliance on the unseen world alienated him from directors and studio heads, who found it impossible to work with an actor who needed to consult a ghost before accepting a role. The sessions were intense and consuming, often taking place at their estate, Falcon Lair, which was rumored to be haunted even before they moved in. Rambova would enter a trance, her hands scribbling furious messages that Valentino would read with reverence, believing they were divine instructions. He believed these spirits were protecting his artistic integrity, but in reality, they were destroying his career by forcing him into artsy, inaccessible films like The Young Raja and Monsieur Beaucaire that alienated his fan base and the press. He famously kept a spirit cabinet in his home where he would retreat for hours, emerging pale and shaken. The most infamous element of Valentino's mystic life was his cursed ring. According to legend, he bought a silver ring with a semi-precious stone from a jeweler in San Francisco, who warned him it was a destiny ring that brought bad luck. Valentino wore it in his final film, The Son of the Sheik. Shortly after, at the age of 31, he collapsed and passed away from a sudden severe infection. The hysteria that followed his passing was unprecedented, with fans committing acts of self-harm and riots breaking out at his funeral in New York. A mysterious woman in black continued to visit his grave for decades, a ritualistic mourning that kept the supernatural legend alive. The ring's journey allegedly continued, bringing misfortune to subsequent owners, reinforcing the idea that Valentino had opened a door to forces he could not close. His life suggests that the immense pressure of being a global idol drove him to seek support from the ether, a dependency that left him vulnerable to the whims of superstition. Even the most grounded and cynical wits of Hollywood were not immune to the allure of the spirit world. Mae West, known for her ribald humor and unshakable confidence, was a devout spiritualist who genuinely believed her screenplays were not written by her, but dictated by departed spirits. West held regular seances in her Ravenswood apartment, inviting mediums to channel voices from the other side. She claimed that a spirit guide she called the Force would take over her hand and write pages of dialogue in minutes, dialogue that would go on to become some of the most famous lines in cinema history. For West, this wasn't a dark or scary practice. It was a source of vitality. She believed that her intimate energy and her spiritual connection were intertwined, fueling her longevity and her career. West was incredibly specific about the conditions required for these communications. She would often perform these sessions after midnight, wearing a silk robe, believing that natural fabrics conducted spiritual energy better than synthetics. She famously employed a psychic named Reverend Thomas Jack Kelly, who lived at her beach house and conducted weekly readings. West credited these spirits with predicting the success of her plays and saving her from bad business deals. She even surrounded herself with a cadre of bodybuilders in her stage show, believing their physical vitality acted as a battery that charged her own psychic powers. However, there was a strange disconnect between her public persona of the self-made woman and her private insistence that she was merely a vessel. In her later years, West became increasingly reclusive, living in a white and gold apartment that visitors described as having an eerie, tomb-like quality, filled with statues of herself and the lingering scent of old gardenias. The apartment became a time capsule, with boxes of chocolates from the 1930s still sitting on tables, gathering dust as if she were waiting for the ghosts of the past to return for a snack. She claimed to see the spirits of her former lovers and even pet monkeys that had passed away years prior. To the outside world, she was a symbol of female empowerment. In private, she was a woman living in a crowded room of ghosts, unwilling to let go of the past or the entities she believed had made her a star. The 1960s and 70s saw a more explicit embrace of organized occultism, and few memberships were as surprising as that of Sammy Davis Jr. The legendary entertainer, known for his conversion to Judaism and his membership in the Rat Pack, briefly but intensely joined the Church of Satan in 1968. Davis was introduced to Anton LaVey at a party and was intrigued by the church's philosophy, which rejected the guilt and shame often associated with religious morality. For a man who had fought for acceptance his entire life, facing prejudice, losing an eye in a car accident, and struggling with addiction, the idea of a religion that celebrated indulgence and ego was intoxicating. It wasn't just a philosophical flirtation. Davis invited LaVey to his shows and sought his counsel on how to navigate the shark-infested waters of show business. He was fascinated by the idea of greater magic, or ritual, to influence outcomes. Davis was not just a casual observer. He was an active participant, wearing a red robe and a Baphomet medallion. And he even had a fingernail on his left hand painted red as a secret sign of his allegiance, a detail often missed in photos from that era. The Rat Pack reportedly found the whole affair baffling, with Frank Sinatra making jokes about Sammy's devilish new friends, though they largely tolerated it as another of Sammy's eccentric phases. Davis even filmed a pilot for a television sitcom in 1973 titled Poor Devil, in which he played a demon working for Lucifer, played by none other than Christopher Lee. The show was not picked up, perhaps because America was not ready to laugh at the devil with their favorite song and dance man. Davis eventually distanced himself from the church, later returning to a more traditional spiritual path, but his brief tenure remains a fascinating anomaly. It speaks to a moment in cultural history when the counterculture opened doors to alternative belief systems, and even the most mainstream stars were tempted to peek inside. If you are enjoying these revelations about the secret spiritual lives of the stars, please make sure to subscribe to our channel so you never miss a future investigation into Hollywood history. While Davis dabbled, Maila Nurmi, known to the world as Vampira, lived the part. She was the original goth icon, creating a persona that was a pastiche of Charles Addams cartoons and silent film vamps. But for Nurmi, Vampira was more than a character. It was an identity forged in fire and tragedy. She was a devotee of various mystical schools and maintained a close, intense friendship with James Dean. The two shared a fascination with the end of life and the afterlife, often engaging in morbid conversations that unsettled those around them. They would take long walks through Los Angeles cemeteries at night, discussing the nature of the soul and whether it was possible to communicate from beyond the grave. They often met at Googie's Coffee Shop on Sunset Boulevard, a brightly lit mid-century diner where their dark conversations stood in stark contrast to the neon surroundings. Nurmi, with her impossibly tiny waist and stark white skin, looked like a creature from another dimension sitting in a vinyl booth. Nurmi claimed that she and Dean had a pact. Whoever passed away first would try to contact the other. This intense spiritual bond became her undoing. When Dean perished in his Porsche in 1955, a vicious rumor circulated that Nurmi had placed a black magic curse on him because he had spurned her romantic advances. The press, looking for a villain in the tragedy of their golden boy, vilified Nurmi. She was harassed, her career was destroyed, and she was effectively blacklisted. The irony was cruel. The woman who played a witch for laughs was persecuted as if she were a real one. Nurmi spent the rest of her life in poverty, painting portraits of Dean and living in a world of her own making, eventually finding a small resurgence of fame in the punk rock era when bands like the Misfits embraced her aesthetic. She maintained until her passing that she had sensed Dean's demise before it happened, a psychic connection that the public twisted into a weapon against her. Her story is a stark reminder of how quickly Hollywood turns on its eccentrics when tragedy strikes. Up until now, we've looked at stars who were victims of superstition or studio marketing. But in the late 1940s and 50s, a new breed of star emerged. These weren't victims. These were practitioners. They didn't just fear the darkness, they invited it in for dinner. Some stars were born into the world of the occult. Kenneth Anger, a child actor who appeared in the 1935 film A Midsummer Night's Dream, grew up to become the most notorious chronicler of Hollywood's sins. As the author of Hollywood Babylon, Anger exposed the scandals of the stars, but his own life was far stranger than anything he wrote. He was a devout follower of Thelema, the religion founded by the British occultist Aleister Crowley. Anger claimed that his films were not just movies, but magical rituals designed to invoke Luciferian energies and alter the consciousness of the viewer. His film Lucifer Rising was intended to be a literal summoning ritual captured on celluloid. The production itself was cursed with drama that rivaled any Hollywood blockbuster. The original lead actor, Bobby Beausoleil, stole the film footage and later became a member of the Manson family participating in the brutal Hinman murder. Anger was deeply embedded in the rock and roll counterculture, influencing figures like Mick Jagger and Jimmy Page, and bridging the gap between old Hollywood glamour and the new age of occultism. He claimed to have placed a curse on Jimmy Page after a falling out, believing that his magical workings could derail the musician's life. Anger viewed Hollywood not as a dream factory, but as a modern pagan temple where stars were the deities. He lived his life according to the principle, do what thou wilt, engaging in rituals and creating avant-garde films filled with occult symbolism. Unlike the other stars who were victims of the system, Anger was a chaotic agent within it, using his insider knowledge to tear down the facade of respectability. He saw the industry as inherently satanic in its materialism and vanity, and he embraced that darkness rather than hiding from it. His work remains a testament to the undercurrent of magic that has always pulsed beneath the streets of Los Angeles. The handsome matinee idol Tyrone Power presented a face of dashing heroism to the world, but his private life was steeped in mysticism. His marriage to the French actress Annabella introduced him to a circle of European intellectuals and mystics who believed in astrology and premonitions. Power became increasingly obsessed with the idea of fate and the timing of his own demise. He reportedly told friends that he knew he would not live to be an old man, a belief that stemmed from astrological readings he took as gospel. He would often have his charts read before starting a new production, looking for auspicious dates and warning signs, a habit that frustrated his directors, but which he refused to abandon. This obsession was not just a quirk. It was a heavy psychological burden. He felt he was racing against a celestial deadline, trying to pack as much life and work as possible into the years he believed he had left. This fatalism affected his career choices and his relationships. He lived with a sense of urgency, as if a clock were ticking that only he could hear. Tragically, his premonition proved accurate. While filming a dueling scene for Solomon and Sheba in 1958, Power suffered a massive heart attack. It happened right on the set in Spain, while fencing with George Sanders. He was rushed to a hospital, but passed away at the age of 44. The eerie parallel to his father, Tyrone Power Sr., who also passed away on a film set in his arms decades earlier, solidified the legend that the Power family was haunted by a tragic destiny. He perished, essentially with his boots on, doing exactly what the stars, both celestial and cinematic, had ordained. His story raises the question of whether believing in a short life becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, a ritual of acceptance that hastens the end. Bela Lugosi did not just play Dracula, he allowed the vampire to consume him. The Hungarian actor, who brought an aristocratic menace to the role in 1931, found himself unable to escape the shadow of the Count. As his career declined and he struggled with substance dependency, on morphine to manage chronic pain from war injuries, the line between Lugosi and his character blurred. He began giving interviews in character, sleeping in a coffin, and surrounding himself with the trappings of the macabre. The tragedy deepened as his mental health declined. Neighbors whispered that he would wander his garden at night in his cape, perhaps believing he was back in the Carpathian Mountains rather than suburban Los Angeles. He became involved with the eccentric director Ed Wood, appearing in films that were far beneath his talent, simply to keep working and to feed his addiction. In one heartbreaking incident, he checked himself into a rehabilitation clinic, becoming the first star to publicly admit to addiction, but the damage to his reputation was done. Footage of him stumbling around his home, confused and disoriented, was later used in Plan 9 from Outer Space after his passing, a ghoulish exploitation of his final days. While much of this was likely a desperate bid for publicity, there were persistent rumors that Lugosi possessed hypnotic abilities in real life. Co-stars claimed he could unsettle them with a look, a skill he may have exaggerated to maintain his mystique. The tragedy of Lugosi was that the industry that made him a monster refused to let him be a man. He was typecast into oblivion, forced to parody himself just to survive. When he passed away in 1956, he was buried in his full Dracula cape, a final request that sealed his bond with the character forever. It was the ultimate surrender to the role, a final ritual in a life that had become a performance. The silent screen star, Alla Nazimova, was one of the most powerful women in Hollywood, and she used her wealth to create a sanctuary that became legendary for its hedonism and secrecy. She converted her mansion on Sunset Boulevard into the Garden of Allah Hotel, a complex of villas that became the playground for the elite. Rumors swirled that the garden was the site of pagan rituals and sewing circles, a code name for lesbian gatherings in an era when such relationships were forbidden. Nazimova, openly bisexual in her private circles, presided over this domain like a high priestess. The architecture itself contributed to the mystique, with lush, labyrinthine gardens and private bungalows that allowed for total discretion. Literary giants like F. Scott Fitzgerald and Dorothy Parker were regulars, mixing with stars like Marlene Dietrich and Greta Garbo. It was said that the pool was shaped like the Black Sea of her homeland, and that midnight swims often turned into bacchanalian parties that lasted until dawn. Residents would often stay for months, losing track of time in the intoxicating atmosphere of the garden. It was a place where careers were born and destroyed over cocktails, a microcosm of Hollywood's hidden underbelly. The Garden of Allah was more than a hotel. It was a cult of freedom in a repressive society. Within its walls, the moral laws of America did not apply. Stars could be their authentic selves, hidden from the prying eyes of the press. However, this freedom came with a dark side. The atmosphere of unchecked indulgence led many residents down paths of substance misuse and self-destruction. Nazimova herself eventually lost her fortune and ended her days living in a small apartment within the complex she once owned, a ghost in her own kingdom. The garden was eventually bulldozed to make way for a strip mall, but its legend, as a place of forbidden rites and secret lives, endures. Barbara Lamar, known as the girl who was too beautiful, lived a life that was a frenetic race against time, fueled by a belief in reincarnation. Lamar was convinced that she had lived many past lives and that her current existence was just a fleeting chapter. This belief justified a lifestyle of extreme excess. She famously said, "I take lovers like roses, by the armful." She slept only 2 or 3 hours a night, fearing that sleep was a waste of the precious time she had. She hosted parties that lasted for days in her Whitley Heights home, surrounding herself with admirers, noise, and distractions, terrified of silence and solitude. She kept her young son hidden from the public to maintain her image, a secret that added to her internal stress. Her philosophy was not just about pleasure, but about maximizing experience before the inevitable transition to the next plane of existence. She was branded by the studio as a dangerous woman, a vamp for the jazz age, and she felt compelled to live up to that destructive title. Her beauty was breathtaking, but her philosophy was nihilistic. She treated her body as a vessel to be used up, consuming illicit substances and alcohol to keep the party going. This wasn't just partying, it was a ritual of consumption. She was sacrificing herself to the idea of the star who burns twice as bright for half as long. Her body eventually collapsed under the strain, and she passed away of tuberculosis and nephritis at the age of 29 in 1926. Her funeral in Los Angeles was a spectacle of grief, attended by thousands. But her philosophy of reincarnation suggests she believed she would simply move on to the next act, leaving the tragedy of Barbara Lamar behind like a shed skin. The comedic genius, Peter Sellers, was a man who claimed to have no self at all. In interviews, he stated that when he looked in the mirror, he saw nothing, a void waiting to be filled. Sellers believed he was a medium, an empty vessel that was possessed by the spirits of the characters he played. When he was Inspector Clouseau, he became Clouseau. When he was Chauncey Gardner, he became him. This went beyond method acting into a form of psychological possession. Sellers relied heavily on clairvoyance and mystics to navigate his life, terrified of making a move without spiritual approval. He was particularly dependent on the advice of Maurice Woodruff, a famous astrologer. Sellers would refuse to wear certain colors, like purple, or sign contracts on certain days based entirely on Woodruff's readings. He was famously superstitious about the color green and believed that birds were a bad omen. On the set of the Pink Panther films, his moods were dictated by these superstitions, creating a tense atmosphere for the crew. After suffering a massive heart attack in 1964, where his heart stopped for over a minute, Sellers claimed he had seen a white light, but felt no comfort from it, only a sense of detachment that deepened his obsession with the unseen. He would fly psychics across the world to consult on minor decisions. This reliance on the external made him a nightmare to his family and colleagues, as his personality would shift violently depending on who he was channeling that week. It was a life of profound instability, a cult of the self, where the self did not exist. It reached a point where Sellers allegedly tried to contact the spirits of the departed, not for comfort, but to ask them how to destroy his enemies. He wasn't just a lost soul. He was a man trying to weaponize the afterlife against the living. We have covered cursed rings and spirit guides, but Hollywood has many more shadows. Comment below, which mysterious Hollywood passing or scandal should we investigate next? Linda Darnell, a stunning brunette beauty of the 1940s, lived with a terrifying, specific phobia that would become a tragic premonition. She had a lifelong fear of fire, yet she was strangely drawn to it. Friends reported that she would sometimes stare into fireplaces in a trance-like state, as if receiving a message she couldn't understand. This fixation on flame was a dark thread running through her life. She often spoke of having nightmares about being trapped in burning buildings, a recurring terror that haunted her sleep for decades. Her career had seen incredible highs, such as A Letter to Three Wives, but by the 60s, she was struggling to find work and dealing with personal demons. In 1965, Darnell was staying at a friend's house in Glenview, Illinois. She and her host's daughter were watching one of Darnell's old films, Stardust, on television late at night. In a cruel twist of fate, the character she played in the film also meets a tragic end. A fire broke out in the living room, likely caused by a cigarette dropped on a sofa. Darnell, perhaps disoriented or paralyzed by her lifelong fear, was trapped on the second floor. She reportedly tried to open a window, but found it frozen shut in the bitter Illinois winter. She was found near the door, having suffered severe burns to 90% of her body. She passed away the next day. The eerie circumstance of her perishing while watching her own image on screen, consumed by the very element she had feared and fixated on since childhood, feels like the closing of a cruel circle, a final, fiery ritual she had been waiting for all her life. The story of Sharon Tate is the most heartbreaking intersection of Hollywood glamour and real-world cult violence. A radiant, gentle woman on the verge of superstardom, Tate was cast in the film Eye of the Devil in 1966, a movie about ritual sacrifice in which she played a witch. It was a role that required her to immerse herself in dark themes, a chilling foreshadowing of her fate. To prepare for the film, the production even hired Alex Sanders, known as the King of the Witches in the UK, as a consultant. Tate was exposed to the rituals and language of the occult as part of her job, handling ceremonial daggers and reciting incantations for the camera. Those who knew Sharon described her as an ethereal presence, someone almost too good for the cynicism of Hollywood. She was not a member of a cult, but she became the innocent sacrifice of one. Her husband, Roman Polanski, had directed Rosemary's Baby, a film that terrified audiences with its depiction of a satanic coven in modern New York, fueling paranoia in the culture. The couple lived on Cielo Drive, a house with a strange history previously owned by music producer Terry Melcher. In August 1969, members of the Manson family, a very real, very dangerous cult, invaded the home. The cult leader, Charles Manson, was a failed musician who believed he was an avenging angel, and he targeted the house specifically because it represented the establishment that had rejected him. Tate, 8.5 months pregnant, was brutally deprived of life in a ritualistic manner intended to incite a race war. The brutality of the crime shattered the innocence of the 1960s. It was the moment when the make-believe darkness of Hollywood movies crashed into the reality of evil. Tate's legacy is often defined by her passing, but those who knew her remember a kind spirit who was simply in the wrong place at the darkest time in American history. James Dean, the symbol of teenage rebellion, had an interest in the occult that went beyond simple curiosity. He was fascinated by the concept of immortality and the idea that a person could cheat demise through fame. Dean befriended Vampira and engaged in rituals intended to expand his consciousness. But his most famous connection to the supernatural involves his car, the Porsche 550 Spider. He nicknamed Little Bastard. Dean had the car customized by George Barris, and he was incredibly proud of it. But everyone who saw it felt a sense of dread. The silver car seemed to have a malevolent energy. Actor Alec Guinness, upon seeing the car outside a restaurant, told Dean, "If you get in that car, you will be found lifeless in it by this time next week." 7 days later, Dean was gone. The car's legend grew after his passing. It reportedly fell on a mechanic, crushing his legs, and was involved in fatal accidents while parts were being transported. Even Dr. Troy McHenry, a surgeon who installed the engine from Dean's wrecked Porsche into his own race car, was deprived of life when he lost control and hit a tree in the very first race he entered. Another driver, William Eschred, used the drivetrain and was seriously injured in a crash the same day. The curse of James Dean suggests that he may have unknowingly entered into a pact, trading a long life for an eternal frozen youth, becoming a permanent icon at the cost of his future. Joan Crawford's life was a testament to the idea that a family can function like a cult, with the parent as the charismatic leader. Crawford was a devout Christian Scientist, a belief system that denies the reality of sickness and relies on prayer for healing. While this is a recognized religion, Crawford applied its tenets, along with her own obsession with cleanliness and order, to her household with tyrannical zeal. She would famously scrub her own floors on her hands and knees, demanding the same level of manic perfection from her children. She even constructed a pool house she called the Barn, where she would retreat and where the children were often terrified to go. Her daughter, Christina's memoir, Mommy Dearest, describes a childhood that resembles life in a high-control group. The children were subjected to bizarre rituals of cleaning, strict dietary controls, and psychological manipulation. Crawford demanded total adoration and obedience, isolating her children from the outside world and creating a reality where her word was law. The cult of Joan required the total erasure of her children's individuality. She would stage night raids, waking the children up to clean if she found a speck of dust on the baseboards. She would strap Christina to her bed to ensure she slept in a specific position. When Christina rebelled, she was cast out, much like an apostate. The psychological scarring was evident. The twins, Cindy and Kathy, were kept separate from the older children, creating a hierarchy of favor and fear. Crawford's story reveals that you don't need a robe and an altar to run a cult. Sometimes all you need is a mansion and a wire hanger. Marjorie Cameron is perhaps the only person on this list who was a genuine practicing occultist first and a Hollywood figure second. A striking redhead with an intense gaze, she was the wife of Jack Parsons, the brilliant rocket scientist and follower of Aleister Crowley. Together, they performed the Babylon Working, a series of intimate magic rituals in the Mojave Desert intended to summon a goddess and usher in the apocalypse. They believed they were conceiving a moon child, a spiritual entity that would change the course of history. Cameron would dress in scarlet robes, reciting ancient Enochian invocations, while Parsons performed the ceremonial rites in the desert stillness. Parsons eventually passed away in a mysterious explosion in his home laboratory in 1952, an event that Cameron believed was a supernatural consequence of their workings. She became a recluse for a time, communicating with what she believed were extraterrestrial entities. Cameron believed she was the Scarlet Woman, prophesied in Crowley's writings. She appeared in Kenneth Anger's film Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome, essentially playing herself, and later in the eerie thriller Night Tide, alongside Dennis Hopper. Her artwork, often depicting alien landscapes and demonic figures, was considered shocking and was even seized by the police in an obscenity raid. Unlike the stars who dabbled for publicity, Cameron lived the magic. She was a true believer who saw Hollywood as a backdrop for her spiritual work. Her life was fringe and dangerous, existing in the shadows where the avant-garde art world met the occult underground. She remains a cult figure in the truest sense, a woman who truly believed she was helping to birth a new aeon for humanity. George Reeves, the man who was Superman to a generation of children, found that wearing the cape came with a heavy price. The Superman curse is a well-known Hollywood legend, citing the misfortunes that befall actors who play the Man of Steel. For Reeves, the role was a trap. He was unable to find other work, typecast as the invincible hero, and he grew increasingly depressed about his career stagnation. His passing in 1959 was ruled a self-inflicted end, but the details have always been suspicious. Reeves was having an affair with Toni Mannix, the wife of Eddie Mannix, a powerful studio executive with deep mob connections. On the night of his passing, his fiancée Lenore Lemon and guests were present, but their stories were inconsistent and their behavior bizarrely calm. They waited nearly an hour before calling the police. The bullet casing was found underneath his body, a near impossibility in a self-inflicted scenario, and there were no fingerprints on the gun. His mother, Helen Besselow, refused to believe the official ruling and hired private investigators to find the truth, though the case was never solved. She even bought the house where he perished, preserving it as a shrine to her son. Many believe Reeves was silenced to cover up the scandal, a hit ordered by the powers that be. In this narrative, the cult is the Hollywood studio system itself, a powerful secretive organization that protects its interests with lethal force. Reeves was a sacrifice to the image of the studio, a man erased because he became inconvenient. If you are enjoying this deep dive into the unknown, please like this video and share it with a friend who loves a good mystery. Judy Garland's life is the ultimate example of the studio system operating as a destructive cult. Signed to MGM as a child, she was immediately placed under a regime of total control. Studio doctors prescribed her amphetamines to keep her working 18-hour days and barbiturates to knock her out at night. This cycle of chemical dependency was not an accident. It was a policy. She was given pep pills to dance and sleeping pills to rest, creating a chemical leash that bound her to the studio's schedule. Her diet was restricted to chicken soup and black coffee to maintain a waif-like figure, starving her growing body. Louis B. Mayer and the executives were the high priests of this order, and Garland was their chosen vessel. They monitored her weight, her dating life, and her every move. This wasn't just management. It was systematic brainwashing. Handlers were assigned to watch her sleep, control her intake, and monitor her thoughts, mirroring the struggle sessions used by political cults to break the ego. Even her birthday parties were staged publicity events where she was forced to pose with props rather than play with friends. Garland wasn't just an actress. She was a prisoner of a high-control group that used sleep deprivation as a primary weapon of submission. She was gaslit into believing she was ugly and talentless without their guidance. The psychological torture she endured, being called a little hunchback by Mayer, was designed to break her will so she could be molded. Garland spent her life trying to deprogram herself from the trauma of her childhood, but the chemical and emotional damage was too deep. She was the sacrificial lamb of the Golden Age, her suffering transmuted into joy for millions of viewers. Finally, we come to Marilyn Monroe, the alpha and omega of Hollywood sacrifice. Her passing in 1962 is the subject of more conspiracy theories than any other event in entertainment history. Was it the Kennedys, the CIA, the Mafia, or was it the inevitable conclusion of a life lived in the grip of a ruthless industry? Monroe was a seeker. Her personal library was filled with books on mysticism, anthroposophy, and the writings of Rudolf Steiner and John Milton. She was desperately looking for a spiritual framework to make sense of her chaotic existence. She studied with Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio, who demanded she unlock her deepest traumas for her art, a process that left her psychologically raw and vulnerable. She constantly sought father figures, from Arthur Miller to Joe DiMaggio, trying to find protection in a world that viewed her as a commodity. Some theorists suggest that her public persona was a form of glamour magic, a mask so powerful it eventually suffocated the woman underneath. Her soft focus photography, her breathless voice, and her platinum hair were all calculated elements of a spell cast on the global public. Her diaries, later recovered, revealed a woman of immense intelligence who felt trapped in a labyrinth of deception. She spoke of a red diary that contained secrets so explosive they could topple governments, a book that mysteriously vanished after her demise. Her housekeeper, Eunice Murray, was seen washing sheets in the middle of the night as police arrived, a strange ritual of cleansing that fueled suspicion. Her passing feels like the final ritual of the studio era, the moment when the goddess was sacrificed to ensure the immortality of her image. Marilyn Monroe passed away so that the icon could live forever, frozen in perfection. But if the studio system was indeed a cult, we have to ask the most terrifying question of all. If they were capable of this then, what kind of rituals are they performing on the stars of today? The Golden Age may be over, but the darkness hasn't left the hills. It just changed its name. These stories remind us that the bright lights of the marquee often cast the longest shadows. Whether these icons sought power through ancient rituals or were forced into the cult of the studio system against their will, they all paid a heavy price for the fame we cherish today. They were beautiful, tragic, and human, struggling to find control in a world that wanted to own them. If you believe the true history of Hollywood deserves to be told, darkness and all, please subscribe to Golden Age Files and click the bell. We dig deeper than the gossip magazines to bring you the stories others forget. Please like this video to help us preserve these memories. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the curses of James Dean and Rudolph Valentino were real, or just tragic coincidences? I read your responses, and I'm curious to know what you believe. Until next time, this is Golden Age Files. Keep the memory alive.